This talk is brought to you by the Bamberg Mathematical Consciousness Science Initiative.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Lenore, for the kind introduction. It's great to be here. I will admit that a lot of what I'll have to say has to do with kind of connections between neuroscience and AI, which I think will be of interest to this crowd. But I will, as promised, given that this venue is about consciousness, have a slide about speculations about how this relates to consciousness at the end, and I think that'll maybe be nice fodder for discussions afterwards, which I really very much look forward to. So just to start things off, the title of my talk is, reverse engineering natural intelligence with embodied agents. So I have maybe kind of two key words here that I'll kind of justify and explain and unpack, which is, natural intelligence and then a focus on embodiment. So kind of maybe the starting point motivation, especially given that a lot of my work kind of intersects with AI, is to kind of look at kind of the places where AI struggles and where maybe you and I as humans, but also even animals don't. And one of the current domains where AI struggles is the physical world. So as some of you may know, the product from OpenAI known as Sora, which is basically a text to video model. So you enter a text prompt, generate a video of a cat climbing a tree, and you get back a very photorealistic, very almost highly, at least animated video at the end. But one thing that's kind of interesting is that you can kind of, when these first products came out, there was a kind of lack of physical realism, despite there being lots of photorealism. And just to kind of illustrate what I mean here, if we kind of take a look at this video, you can kind of see this chair just kind of pop out of nowhere. And then as people interact with the chair, it sort of looks like it's floating in space, right? There's like this weirdness of how it interacts with people. It doesn't really seem to match our physical intuitions, and it just folds in weird ways, right? And so the kind of pre-training at scale has been, of course, really crucial to even generate videos that look like this. I remember over the past 10 years, it was just very hard to get anything that looked remotely as photorealistic as this. But there still seems to be something missing in that it doesn't seem to understand contact and object permanence and things like this that even babies are very much already good at early on in their development. And what I'm going to argue maybe for the rest of this talk is like what might be missing is perhaps needing in AI not just kind of passive pre-training of next token prediction, but some more active embodied agency and interaction with the world to really try to understand it and engage with it to build a good world model. And now kind of coming now to the second part of my title about natural intelligence, why are we looking to natural intelligence in particular? And I sort of like to think of it as like animals and humans kind of perform behaviors that we've yet to engineer successfully in AI agents. So I've kind of listed a few like this, but at a high level, these involve predicting the world, which requires modeling it, like I mentioned, in this more physically realistic way, and then using it to plan through that world model, which also requires persistent memory, which is something we don't really fully yet have with even chat agents at the moment, let alone in videos. Adaptive motor control, so adapting online and not only being autonomous, but being really an online lifelong learner. So not just over long horizon, not just over the next 15 minutes, but really being able to maintain and update things without forgetting everything. So the test time reasoning paradigm that we see with like OpenAI's O1 or O3 models, and even in Gemini, is just the beginning, right? There's no weight updates happening there. It's just that inference time after the weight's been trained, but it's really just the beginning of this kind of like working towards these autonomous lifelong learning agents, and there's still a lot to do there. Now, unlike maybe kind of where I break a little bit of tradition with standard kind of systems neuroscientists, is that I don't really think it's productive or fruitful to like look at detail at the like neural circuits in the brain and try to figure out what's missing and then do this reverse engineering. That's not what I mean by reverse engineering. Rather, what I mean is kind of more cognitive motivation. In other words, that the specific capabilities of humans and animals the behaviors that they can do, e.g., the ones I'm listing here, just at a high level, start to become goals or concrete engineering targets as we're trying to build more capable, intelligent agents. And so we really think of them as setting goalposts or behaviors for us to try to achieve. And as a result, you might see why I don't include language here, for example. So everything I'm kind of including here is really pre-language, which is where we need to work towards more so. Now, it also turns out that doing this kind of reverse engineering program, like optimizing for a behavior or for a goal, also kind of converges onto a better brain model. In fact, better than maybe what came before it in computational neuroscience. So just as a canonical example, as I'll illustrate here in the field of NeuroAI, over the past 10 years, computer vision was a really big area and still is, but in particular, optimizing for categorization. So where you're categorizing images of cats, dogs, from 1,000 categories on ImageNet. And that's what I'm displaying on the x-axis here is just top one accuracy. And on the y-axis, what I'm showing is how well the internal representations of ComNets or vision transformers are at predicting actual real biological response patterns from the artificial units as they're getting better and better at this task. In other words, what we see where each dot here is a model is a kind of strong convergence on models that do better at ImageNet end up developing internal representations that also predict brain data really well without us necessarily intending to do it. We didn't optimize for matching the brain. It was a kind of byproduct of doing this task well. And so what we're seeing basically is an alignment between an AI goal of doing a task better, in this case, categorizing naturalistic images, and a neuroscience goal of kind of understanding why neural responses are as they are, like being able to explain neural response variability of, say, hundreds of neurons, if not thousands of them across hundreds of images through optimization on a goal. Now, we can ask ourselves this kind of question. Did we get lucky in vision that there's this correspondence? At the end of the day, CNNs are kind of biologically inspired. Or is there kind of a deeper principle at play that we can apply to other domains as well? And in fact, what I'll show you is that this is kind of a broader theory, as we might call it, in the sense of task optimized modeling, which is that kind of the four things that we do when we do neural network research, when we do task optimization in kind of machine learning terms, which I've displayed on the left here, namely specifying an architecture class, specifying an objective function or a task loss, a data set on which to optimize it, and then a learning rule like backpropagation or SGD, if you may have heard of that, to optimize those weights. They all actually have like real physical mappings to things we care about or think about in neuroscience. So in particular, for example, the architecture class is a hypothesis of the wiring diagram or the circuit neuroanatomy that we think might be going on of how the neurons are actually connected to one another. The task loss, for example, is a hypothesis of the ecological niche of the behavior that we think that brain area is thought to perform. So in the case of the visual system, it was object recognition, right? At least for the first 100 milliseconds of visual processing that we're looking at there. The data set is the environment. So in this case, the set of naturalistic images, that's the kind of ecological diet that the visual system's optimized for. So for example, if we were to optimize neural networks, not on naturalistic images, but to do weird bespoke tasks like barcode reading, they wouldn't be good representations of the actual visual system. It does matter that you're doing the types of tasks and the types of environments that the brain is optimized to do. And then finally, the learning rule itself is a proxy for both the long time scales of the evolutionary pressures that occur at long time scales of natural selection, but also synaptic plasticity that occurs online during an organism's development. So we can kind of really think of backpropagation as really a proxy for getting to the adult state of the animal quickly, within our lifetimes in a more directed way. And the confluence of these four components gives rise to an artificial neural network whose artificial responses we actually regress and compare quantitatively to real neural population responses in biological brains. And it turns out that not all combinations of these things yield good matches to the brain. Many fall to the wayside. So it's a kind of iterative process that allows us to kind of improve the models and their match to the brain as time goes on. And so really what we're doing, in effect, by doing these task optimizations is designing ML algorithms that are optimized to perform the behavior that an organism is thought to do under the same kind of constraints that the organism faces. Um, and what this yields is two types of things. This kind of task optimized modeling is one, a kind of quantitatively accurate and practically useful brain model. So it's, now that you have like some artificial or in silico system that can quantitatively match response patterns to neural populations in a biological brain, you can now kind of like do much more cheaply experiments in silico with it, do kinds of causal perturbations, et cetera, and generate hypotheses for new types of experiments that are just, much easier to do and test out before actually going and trial running them in the biological system, where experiments cost a lot more money and take a lot more time. Now that's an engineering outcome. A lot of what I'll focus on today is kind of maybe more, especially for this audience, like more the philosophical, the scientific import of having these types of detailed quantitative models, which is that they tell us organizing principles of why neural responses are as they are. So in other words, if we're optimizing a neural network for a task, and that kind of very much determines, better than any other theory we've had before, the response variability and the response properties of the actual biological system, then it's a strong hypothesis for the types of constraints and tasks that brain area is thought to perform over the course of evolution. Now, the reason why this might be arising, why is it that doing AI is kind of giving in this kind of, by working on the same kind of challenging problems that the brain had to solve, gives us kind of almost as a byproduct a very good hypothesis of brain function. Comes down to what was very nicely articulated by Rosa Chow and Dan Yeomans, known as the contravariance principle, which is that basically the harder the task, the smaller the solution set, the more constraining it is. So what's happening is that, not every thing can solve ImageNet. And it turned out that only a few sets of things, few sets of inductive biases could really do that. And as a result, because there's fewer solutions to that problem, we land with high probability in the same space that the brain landed in. To take an even more extreme example, the goal of AI really is to build like autonomous lifelong agents for robotics, of which we have a solution set of 0 right now. We have our solution set, which is us and animals, but we don't have one in artificial sense. And in some sense, that is sort of like maybe the most constraining task of all, right? And so we do continue to expect that this contravariance principle will hold as we go to harder and harder AI tasks, like the ones I laid out, which animals and humans can do that are concrete engineering targets. The AI version of this of the contravariance principle is also known as the Platonic representation hypothesis, which you may have heard of as well. Again, same idea: harder tasks, less solutions that can solve all of them. And I kind of like to render. There's a quote that I really like that kind of summarizes this whole effort, which is that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. And the related kind of neuroscience specific one, which is that nothing in the brain makes sense except in the light of behavior, right? Optimizing for the behavior for hard behavior really does constrain the internal representations that are learned and that become brain-like as a byproduct. And so maybe the credo that we'll take for the rest of this talk is nothing in maybe computational neuroscience makes sense except in light of task optimization. So task optimization will kind of be our hammer that we're going to continue to use over and over and compare these models to various brain responses. But one thing we should kind of get off the bat here before we continue is what counts as good when we're doing this kind of model brain alignment. At the end of the day, is it 100% alignment? Is that what we expect? Well, it turns out that even when you compare two brains to each other under the same exact stimulus conditions, trying to hold fixed the right population topographically, et cetera, there still is evolutionary variability in the responses between those two organisms. So those two individuals, even of the same species. So what that tells us is that 100% explained variance isn't actually the right target, but rather what it should be is how good two animals are to each other up to that kind of similarity. And so we formalized this as in a position paper called the NeuroAI Turing test recently. Though we've been doing this for a long time, but it's usually always been in the appendix of the paper, so we thought it'd be useful to state it. But the reason why it's called Turing test, then the Turing test, we often look at the behavior, right? We just look at the outputs of the system, not the internals, right? We often say, well, if the chatbot can convince me it's a human better than similar to any other human, then maybe we can call it intelligence. But really, what we're saying here is that we don't only care about behavior or matching behavior, which is one thing, but also looking at the internal representations to see if they match up to the brain-to-brain similarity. So this NeuroAI Turing test is kind of going to be a recurring theme where I'm going to kind of have a bar there, and that's kind of going to be our upper bound. It's going to be a line of how good the animals are to each other on that data set, and that's the kind of thing we're going to climb when we're doing the model brain comparisons. So nowadays, what we're kind of in a revolution in neuroscience where we're collecting more and more brain data, right? And the way this NeuroAI Turing test connects to what we're going to do here. This, for example, is from the International Brain Laboratory from a rodent brain with neuropixel probes. So you can record thousands of units while the animal is awake and behaving. And so, with this data comes a bigger question of like how we're going to make sense of all this and get a window into cognition. And really what we're going to do here is build embodied agents and check if their internals pass the NeuroAI Turing test on this type of whole brain data that's being collected. So by doing kind of large scale AI, we're able to, start to kind of meet the demands of the large scale neuroscience data sets that are coming online with better and better recording techniques. And the question that the scientific question we're going to try to answer with this approach of building these body agents and comparing them to the brain up to brain-to-brain similarity is how does the brain build and use world models? And I kind of like to think of world models as having 4 components: representing the world, predicting the next state, planning, and then enabling action. And we can kind of think of like building up an agent that has these as each of its own modules, and then comparing each of those modules to actual brain area responses. So here I'm highlighting just to kind of parallel the video I just showed you. Again, a rodent brain, and each of these modules is color coded to see which of its internal representations best match that brain area. So the perceptual module maybe best matches visual areas. The future inference module might best match MPFC. Planning, maybe hippocampus, motor, cerebellum, and M1. So now this is just a schematic. And in fact, we're not limited to just one organism, but rather this entire sensory motor loop is shared across species. So we actually have a lot more data than just being restricted to any one organism. In fact, we could imagine building embodied agents for each of these brain types and seeing, between rodents, macaques, and humans, any kind of similarities and differences between what are the objective functions and architectures that make these best match to these brain areas doing this kind of sensory action. So in fact, these cross-species comparisons are going to be something I'm going to show throughout. So what I'm going to do is for the rest of the talk and what remains, I'm going to go and like build up this agent from the ground up. So I'm going to start with perception, then I'm going to go to future inference and planning, and then taking actions under intrinsic goals. So just to start with about perception, just to share some of our work there, one of the kind of big AI challenges was that, if you look at a baby kind of going about its environment, it doesn't seem to have like a very well-directed goal, right? It's kind of exploring, and it's very like mostly unsupervised manner. And in fact, if we go to animals, the situation is even more obvious. It's like, it's not that, I showed you this example with the visual system, how we train with category labels, right? But it's not like this baby or these animals are actually learning about the world through words that are written in the sky about this, the cat, this is the dog, this is the toy, or whatever. But rather, there's just no way that they receive the same kind of dense supervision signal that we often would give artificial neural networks. So while task like categorization might have been an effective proxy to build a visual system, it seems to be like deeply wrong. There must be some unsupervised way of getting the same kind of performance and also the same type of internal representations. So about 5 years ago, there was a breakthrough in self-supervised learning from many different labs that kind of did better than the standard techniques that came before it, like autoencoding, et cetera, that were basically the idea was to say, look, let's train objective functions that don't require some external supervised category label, but involve, taking 2 different views of this dog or 2 different views of this image, for example, and contrasting it with different different images. So like an image of a cat or an image of a different dog. And the high level of these methods is to make the representations non-trivially robust to data augmentations. And it's sort of inspired by how we sample the world via head motion. I can look at different portions of, say, like this cup, and distinguish it from my hand, right? And so that's like a form of contrastive learning at a very kind of coarse way. And it turned out that these neural networks that were optimized, so this was work that was done in my lab that I was a part of, that was led by Chengxu Zhuang, who's now at Meta, is that once you optimize these, you can actually go and compare them to the same kind of macaque visual system data that I showed you in the beginning. And what we found was that basically having this kind of contrastive objective best matched the visual system responses of the primate. So neural networks that are optimized for this contrastive objective developed those internal representations that were brain-like. And they basically, for primate data, they basically matched what we got with categorization, but just without that dense kind of supervision label that was kind of deeply wrong conceptually. A natural question we can ask, though, is, not every, you can say, well, look, like primates maybe are more object-centric. This kind of categorization objective is like an especially good proxy for that. And so maybe that's why the contrastive objectives aren't really doing any better than the categorization objective. They're just kind of really a proxy. But you can imagine going in other species, like, I don't know, like rodents, for example, where maybe we'll do even better. Maybe it's just a bit more general. The self-supervised objective is just a more general principle of other species, better so than categorization. And so during my PhD, we assessed this ourselves as in a separate study. Once we had once there was that kind of AI breakthrough of like a better self-supervised, unsupervised learning algorithm for vision, we could then go and apply it to rodent visual data that was being collected by the Allen Institute at the time. One thing that was interesting is that at the time, the reason why this was a project was that people were comparing the categorization optimized networks to mouse visual cortex data, and we're finding, man, they're not a good match, unlike in the case of primates. So was this entire kind of research program of task optimization wrong, or were we just missing the constraints, the right objective, the right architecture, et cetera? Because keep in mind that, the deep CNNs are really inspired by the hierarchy of the primate visual system, which I'm showing you on the left here. But if you look at mouse, it's really shaped like a paw, its visual system. So primary visual area V1 is kind of the largest area, and then you have a bunch of these higher order areas that are in parallel that kind of branch off of it. So it's much less hierarchical. So you might assume, man, there's something functionally different just by looking at it by eye. And in fact, this actually gets rendered out functionally too. So we compared our contrastive models per layer. Here we found that they outperformed actually the same exact architecture, but with a categorization objective across mouse visual areas that we had the data for. And this data was collected by the Allen Institute. And in fact, relating back to the animal-to-animal similarity, the mouse-to-mouse similarity, the NeuroAI Turing test, we get to about 90% of the NeuroAI Turing test for this data set by having this contrastive objective rather than the supervised categorization one. So we might ask ourselves, why might we see this improvement of this contrastive objective in this case over the primate? Why is the mouse visual system preferring self-supervision? And our hypothesis is that it's basically trying to do as many tasks as possible without specializing in one really well, like categorization. And that's what its contrastive objective is affording it to do. And the way we test this was we train our visual system and then embed it in this completely different task, this out of distribution task of reward-based navigation. And particularly the way we tested this was we took our in silico mouse visual cortex, we froze its weights, and then we embedded it into a biomechanically realistic rodent body that was developed by Benjamin Leslie's group at Harvard. And then we basically train a decision-making policy on top of it. And so what you're seeing here is actually a first-person view of the policy that's learned from our vision network with this biomechanical rodent body. And it's basically navigating the maze at the same kind of visual resolution a mouse would get, roughly speaking. And the task is that it gets reward when it hits these blue orbs, basically. So it's doing a kind of ethologically relevant task that the rodent could do in this kind of new domain that it wasn't trained for. And it's just different altogether. It's not just new images, it's just a different kind of task. And what we found is that over the supervised objective, the kind of contrastive self-supervised model, right, does a lot better. And part of the reason is that there aren't labels that are written out in the sky for it. It generalizes much better because it just kind of better understands the kind of structure of the visual world without dense supervision. And you can go the other way. You can train in the maze environment and use the rewards as a supervision signal as a supervised baseline and evaluate a bunch of visual scene understanding tasks that are held out. And we can show that across all of these, again, the contrastive objective outperforms the supervised one in terms of generalizing to new settings. Now, another question we could ask is like, look, a lot of these examples have been vision-based, and vision isn't really like the hallmark of rodent sensory processing, right? There's olfaction, there's tactile processing where you can use his whiskers to sense the world. There's all kinds of other things. What about those modalities? Is there a shared principle? Does this contrastive objective continue to hold even there? And what we just showed actually this year that appears in NeurIPS as an oral with my students at CMU, Trinity, and Yuchen, who led it, is looking at tactile processing in particular. And one of the reasons why we picked tactile processing as the other sensory modality looking to is that from an AI point of view, again, motivated by the fact that animals can do a bunch of tasks really well that we want AI to do well on, is that tactile data itself is very useful for manipulating occluded or out of distribution objects. So, imagine you're a robot and you're in an environment where you can't always see all the objects in front of you. It's useful to be able to feel them and touch them, kind of like imagine you're searching for your car keys. It's very useful to have that tactile feedback. And we're kind of at an interesting inflection point in robotics where we're not there yet, but the tactile hardware, robot hands, and simulation are getting better and better. And it's still considerably underexplored, not only in neuroscience computationally, but also in robotics. My student Trinity actually did a search on arXiv, and you can already see this from the number of papers on tactile processing is much less than in, say, vision. And in fact, many tactile models themselves aren't truly tactile. They aren't operating with the same kinds of time-varying force and torque inputs that animals receive or hands would get, right? As you touch an object, it's you feel the surface of it, and that varies across time. But rather, a lot of it is very much depth camera based. So what people do is they use something called gel sight, where you say you have some surface like a coin or whatever, and then you stamp it, and then you record the depth map that emerges. So it's very non-interactive, very non-temporal, very unlike how we sense the world in this interactive way. But it's amenable to the common strategies of self-supervised learning that you can just kind of drop off the shelf from vision, because it's still treating touch as a kind of vision-based input. But this is very much not the case in real naturalistic settings. And what our hypothesis was going into this was that model architecture is kind of in line with the contravariance principle I showed you at the beginning, that mimic brain-like processing will yield better performance for tactile data. And so the way we tested this was that we developed a very large-scale data set of interacting with objects with a biomechanically realistic whisker sensor. So just to kind of show this again, the objects kind of whisk by the whisker, and they generate forces across time. And the whisker simulator was developed earlier by Mitra Hartmann's group in Northwestern. And we can kind of do lots of sweeps. And it turned out that actually once you get this time-varying signal of force and torques, the types of self-supervised augmentation, the ways in which you train the model completely changed than from the case of vision. So we had to develop our own augmentations. So that's kind of maybe like the AI aspect of things to get this to work even. A lot of this has to do with how you, like in the sequence, basically when you process it to maintain the temporal order, when you're doing these flips across space and across time and preserving the spatial, where in space, where on the whisker pad it hit. And what we found was just that by having the right tactile augmentation, we did much better than the standard image augmentations off the shelf that normally people would apply and work well off of depth inputs, but don't work well with these kinds of time-varying inputs. It also forced us to explore a larger space of architecture. So I'm sure maybe many of you heard of the transformer, but there's lots of other sequence models. In addition to the transformer, there's Mamba and S4 state space models, they're called, as well as recurrent neural networks, RNNs, which came before it. And no single choice of these architectures is unilaterally better on all sequence learning tasks. So what we wanted to explore was this larger space of possible recurrent architectures. including RNNs that are kind of unrolled in a biologically plausible way. So where each time step corresponds to propagating through one layer to the next. So that's the conv RNN you're seeing on the bottom left here of the encoder layer. And then what we do is we choose one of these three possible encoders, and then we choose whether we do some kind of attention with it as well, some kind of transformer-based attention across time once we've kind of learned the low-level features in the encoder stage. And then we train with one of three possible objective functions, kind of dense supervised categorization, contrastive learning, which I just mentioned, and then auto-encoding as another baseline. And so this kind of allowed us to swap out various things that we would call this the encoder attender decoder. And we actually have our code online as well if you want to take a look and train your own, both biologically realistic unrolled models, but also EAD architectures that build on top of it. But ultimately, what we found through all this kind of engineering effort was that if we looked at the categorization accuracy, what we found was that often the best kinds of encoders were convolutional RNN models. And in fact, those that had this kind of biologically realistic unrolling strategy just ended up doing the task better. This is absent even comparing to any brain data at the moment. So it engaged with the temporal dynamics a lot better on this type of data than, say, standard things like state space models or transformers. And furthermore, this kind of like AI win of just doing the tactile recognition task better allowed us to also explain neural response data better. So Chris Rogers had released an open source data set, and this is one of the beauties of neural data recording techniques getting better and better, is that more and more people are actually putting these data sets online and making them freely available. And so here's an example of recordings from somatosensory cortex of the rodent while it encounters two types of objects, convex and concave, at varying distances. And we could simulate this kind of active whisking exactly in our simulator because we had a biomechanically realistic one as well, and then kind of send those force and torque inputs to all of our models. And again, what we found was that the best models that reach this kind of animal-to-animal consistency, which I'm kind of highlighting at the top left here, were these contrastive self-supervised loss functions that are trained on these recurrent networks. So again, this kind of contrastive SSL, but with a recurrent encoder. The same types of models that did well on the tactile recognition task. So going forward, we'd love to try this on data sets with a lot more conditions, neural data sets to further separate models. But the main takeaway is that these biologically realistic recurrent models outperform the models on state space models and transformers on realistic tactile recognition, and the best match neural responses in mouse barrel cortex. So again, we're seeing this kind of consistent theme across mouse and primates visual systems, and now rodent visual systems and tactile systems, of this contrastive self-supervised objective. So maybe our current best theory right now of perception here, kind of aggregating across these different data sets, is maybe it's some form of recurrence in the encoder, which is actually well supported even by anatomy. If we look at these areas, they're highly recurrent. So that's not surprising. But the maybe more surprising thing is it's done in this kind of contrastive self-supervised way that you can kind of infer from head motion. Now, on to the next kind of portion of this agent, which is predicting the world, right? We don't just represent the world in the time step that we're in. We also can predict future states based on those representations that are passed to this kind of future inference module, this world model. And so this was work I did in my postdoc. And we looked at this phenomenon of mental simulation. And what I mean by that is oftentimes when we look at pixels in this image, right, of these two ice blocks, we can infer that the one on the right has been out longer than the one on the left by our understanding of temperature and how those dynamics unfold in time. And this is something that goes beyond the pixels and the immediate object categories in this image, right? So another example is my cat will predict whether this box will support her when she gets on it. And I can plan intervening actions of how to take these hats off the rack just by looking at this image, and it's not in those pixels directly, I'm simulating it. And of course, this doesn't just apply in static images, but also videos as well. So if I show you this liquid hitting a staircase, it's as though the staircase is actually there. And you kind of infer that yourself just by looking at it. And so what we want to understand is what are the functional constraints that enable us to predict this future state across diverse settings? So we tried a variety of hypotheses, and I'll go into the main one. But just to show you at a high level, once we train these kind of video foundation models that predict the future state of their environment at scale, we then compared their internal representations both to human behavior in rich 3D environments and detailed neurophysiological recordings from macaques as they're doing a kind of mental Pong task where they're playing Pong, but the ball hides behind the screen before it intercepts the paddle, so they have to stimulate the ball in their head as they perform this task. Now, just to kind of explain the main model class here, the basic idea was to learn and perform a challenging vision task to enable it to learn an implicit representation of the physical world. So I spent a lot of time trying to build more explicit things with object slots or pixel prediction, and that didn't really work. And what seemed to work better was to learn a latent and then future predict in that latent, predict the next time steps latent. And you can ask then, what vision task should we pre-train this latent representation on? And one thing that's kind of important to keep in mind, again, going back to this theme of thinking about the capabilities of human and animals and what they do well as concrete engineering targets, is that we don't just engage with static images like I've shown you thus far, we engage with very dynamic scenes. And so right as I started my postdoc, Meta had just collected this Ego 4D data set where participants wear head-mounted cameras and go about their day performing everyday actions. And what they found was that if you take this contrastive objective that I've been showing you thus far, but now take it from static images and apply it across time where you're doing temporal contrastive learning. So you're pushing together representations of frames that are closer together in time as positive examples and repelling them from frames that are much earlier. You end up learning representations that actually transfer quite well to out-of-distribution robotic tasks, out-of-distribution embodied tasks. In fact, these models also end up better predicting these video foundation models I'm showing you on the right. When you compare their internal representations to about 2,000 neurons that are in macaque dorsal medial frontal cortex, where it's the animals doing this kind of future prediction, it's kind of world model or physics engine, they better predict that than, say, the static kind of image foundation models I showed you before that are just doing things like categorization or segmentation, et cetera. And it's not enough just to pre-train on Ego 4D just to learn a latent, but it's actually important we can show as a control that you need to actually future predict in that latent state. You actually need to predict the next state of the world using that latent representation to best match the neural responses that we got. And we can furthermore compare on the y-axis the same kind of neural predictivity of the models, which we aren't optimizing for. We're just comparing after the fact, like in all cases, as well as how well they predict large-scale human behavioral data on richer kind of naturalistic scenes to see if there's kind of a model that can match both human and macaque behavioral data, right? Because both of these can predict, both humans and animals can predict in 3D settings, and both humans and animals can play the game of Pong, right? So there's some kind of shared substrate. We want to see, was there a single model that can explain them best? And what we found across those is that the model that was exposed to the largest variety of egocentric video sources then transferred the best across the widest range of embodied tasks, both best explained the brain data, but also the behavioral data. However, I think there's, in just domain of world modeling, there's still a ways to go to reach the animal to animal or subject to subject NeuroAI Turing test here. And I'm happy in the discussion section to talk more about some ideas that we have in that domain. So going from just the physically, these models are more physically realistic rather than photorealistic because they're predicting a latent, which is kind of the problem I mentioned at the beginning here. But I think there's more to improve. But maybe where things stand right now is maybe when it comes to the future inference module, our best theory right now in terms of models of brain comparisons is latent future prediction. It learns this kind of latent representation through contrastive SSL in the perception module down below it, and then it's trying to predict in that future latent representation. So just to kind of go towards the last section here is we don't just predict the world passively, right? We also then make plans in those predictions and take actions, right? And they're guided by intrinsic goals that aren't provided to us externally often. So let me just start a little bit to kind of preempt this a bit, the planning case, some work we did in planning. So what you're seeing here is a top-down view of a rodent navigating its environment, and the dots here represent place cells that are activating its hippocampus as it enters a particular location. And it turns out that not only are these aptly called place cells involved in how animals navigate and plan actions, there's another brain area known as medial entorhinal cortex that consists of things like grid cells, which there was the 2014 Nobel Prize came to, that have very regular firing fields, which I'm showing you here on the top left. And then there's also border cells, which constitute about 10 to 12% of the population that fire at environmental boundaries, at walls and things like that. But a large fraction of the cells that people weren't really looking at because they had less interpretable response patterns as a function of space were these heterogeneous cells. There's cells that had kind of blobby and weird looking patterns, and no one really had a human language explainable reason for them, right? For the grid cells, it's like there's periodicity and Fourier analysis you could do that has a really nice story for a Nature paper. And place cells have a really nice story, right? They fire in a particular location of space, but then all these other cells just are weird and they don't make any sense. And it turned out that, so this was the work I did in 2021, which was a NeuroAI Spotlight, was simply that if you train neural networks to do this kind of same navigation task, so do this kind of dead reckoning where they're integrating velocities across time to go to the next position, you can actually develop internal representations by doing this kind of path integration optimization that match the same distribution of varying cell types that we see in the real brain data. This percentage, by the way, is percentage I actually quantified in the brain data. It was collected by my collaborator, Caitlin Mallory. And in fact, it also mattered the type of objective function for that path integration, for that navigation. It turned out that you actually had to put in simulated place cells, not just XY positions directly, in order to get this distribution. And that kind of makes sense physically because hippocampus kind of rests atop of medial entorhinal cortex. And furthermore, just from a cognitive point of view, like it's not like the animal has direct access to its XY position. It must be encoded somehow. And these place cells are really doing that encoding. So it makes both biological but also cognitive sense that this is kind of happening after the fact. Okay, so some kind of temporal integration is happening. Can we use that from the planning case to then kind of finally complete this picture into taking actions? So this is work that also appeared in NeurIPS this year that has to do with understanding these intrinsic goals that we then use to guide our planning, this final piece of the agent. And in fact, this culminates in maybe the first kind of autonomous agent that can predict whole brain data where we're not actually fitting to any animal behavior. And so going back to this picture I showed you in the beginning, with the baby, we don't really know. One of the reasons autonomy is hard is we don't know what the goal is or how it's computationally formalized. We don't know what success means, right? There's no like direct thing that it's optimizing here. It looks like it's just like kind of randomly playing. And in neuroscience, we've kind of largely ignored autonomous task independent behavior. And oftentimes, intelligence is often attributed when some goals are easily identifiable, right? Like when a mathematician like Grigori Perelman here is doing something, we quantify that and say, wow, that's an intelligent thing. But we often don't ascribe that kind of intelligence to babies. But the reason why it's like an intelligence problem is that unlike in games where reinforcement learning has succeeded, like Go and chess, like from the work of DeepMind, the environment doesn't have some dense reward function that it gives us, right? We have to set these goals somehow. It's internally generated by the organism. And so we look to the larval zebrafish as inspiration. And so one of the reasons why it was interesting is that you can they swim in their environment. And in fact, if you cut off the feedback to them, so this is work by Misha Arens, they learn to give up, actually. They realize that their actions aren't affecting the world in virtual reality, and then they give up, and then they try again. And this is kind of nice because it's a naturalistic environment. We're not training the fish to do this. There's a clear behavioral readout of giving up. And the nice thing about this organism is that its skull is transparent. So you can actually record its whole brain. You can image its whole brain, the whole population activity while it's doing this task. And in fact, here's an example of this. They image, so this is Misha Arens' group at Genelia that imaged larval zebrafish, both the neurons as well as a non-neuronal cell type known as radial astrocytes. And when we tried to kind of build a computational theory of this type of autonomy, what we found was that a lot of the kind of prior work in Intrinsic RL is very much information theoretic. So it's about maximizing surprisal. The trouble with surprisal is that, not only did it only kind of apply to these kind of toy environments, but when we would kind of apply it to our little swimmer agent here, it often led to very unethological behaviors. It didn't really move forward or anything like that. And in fact, if I replace this entire screen with white noise pixels, what happens with these kind of surprisal objectives is they can really fixate on it, right? Because from an information theoretic point of view, white noise is maximally surprising. But from an organism point of view, a zebrafish wouldn't spend much time on it, nor would a baby, nor would us, right? We wouldn't expend our energy and infinitely on white noise. So this suggested that there was a kind of core issue with epistemic curiosity. It's not enough, but rather we wanted to incorporate priors. So we have some memory of what it means to a world model, basically, of what it means for the organism to have a world model of moving forward in the world of its dynamics, and then use that as a prior on which to condition how much progress it's making in that world model. So it's not information theoretic, it's more progress driven. And anyway, we then embodied this in a realistic zebrafish. So my master's of robotics student, Lynn Kirsch, really developed the skin on top of it in this kind of simulated fluid. And then we could train with these various intrinsic drives, including our progress-driven one. And here's like a first-person view of the animal as it's kind of navigating with this kind of intrinsic drive, just from the point of view of its eyes. And all of its behavior is driven by optic flow and proprioception, just like in the real animal. And this is kind of like the brain of the animal, the agent itself that we're going to put in, and we're going to track progress in its model of the world via our intrinsic progress loss, what we're calling 3M progress, model memory mismatch progress. And basically, the idea is to partition the state space into both where it agrees with its prior, with its world model of swinging forward, and where it disagrees, and keep tracking that progress in that world model. And I'm happy to go into the details as we in the discussion section. But the main thing is that this connects to the planning section where we're talking about path integration and integrating temporally across time. We're basically going to use this memory to guide adaptive behavior over time and track this mismatch over time and integrate it with this kind of gamma parameter. So we're going to consistently do this kind of temporal integration as well. And this is what happens when we put it in this embodied agent. It can swim forward. It leads to a lot more ethological behaviors and those kind of surprisal information theoretic objectives. And furthermore, if we look at the brain of that artificial agent, it can best match the real brain almost to 99% explained variance of the whole brain data, not just the neurons, but also the non-neuronal cell types, the radial astrocytes, which, as far as we know, this is kind of the first task optimized account of non-neuronal cells, but also match the behavior as well. So we have both. We're passing the NeuroAI Turing test here because we're matching both the behavior of the animal in this setting and also its internal representations. Okay, so just to kind of end this here, maybe the kind of overall picture that we have is some kind of recurrence plus contrastive SSL for the perception that produces a latent that we then future predict to have a kind of world model, and then finally we temporally integrate through that world model how much progress we're making. Maybe this is kind of a very basic first step towards a kind of complete agent model of at least animal autonomy. Now I'm putting these things in question marks because at the end of the day, we haven't collected all the brain data there is in the world. We can probably continue to falsify these. There's probably improvements to be made, but I'm just kind of listing them out as high-level summaries of like what we know to the best of our knowledge at this time. And I'm excited to see how this picture will evolve. Now, given that, just to kind of end on this, given that this is a topic of consciousness, and I do think that intelligence doesn't necessarily beget consciousness and vice versa, you might want to ask, like, well, what does this all mean maybe for testing consciousness? And I'm happy to, I'm kind of keeping this open-ended just to be fodder for discussion. But the kind of thing maybe we can all agree on is that we don't yet know the necessary or sufficient brain observables or more concretely agent architectures that give rise to subjective experience, what it means to be me. And we don't even know if zebrafish have it, right? Nor do we know whether our zebrafish agent has it, right? And so we're kind of in this weird conundrum. But I do think we can make progress on this question. In fact, by kind of following the same kind of program in NeuroAI, we're Popperian in some sense. We're basically, we have a bunch of hypotheses, a bunch of bars that you see, and then we go and falsify it against real brain data. And I think what we need in general is, just as it's infinitely difficult to like look at a brain, look at all the neurons, and just try to infer what's going on without some model, and then comparing that model to brain data, right? Like we're doing here, right? We wouldn't have been able to infer contrastive SSL at all just from looking at the brain. It had to come from a combination of, look, animals don't use labels, and then trying to get that from head motion, inspired by head motion a little bit, to build that as an objective function, and then finally go and compare that, the internals of that artificial neural network to brain data. I think we need to do something similar if we want to have more formal or mathematical guarantees on consciousness. Ultimately, it's the thing we can all agree on is it comes from human brains, right? And so I think maybe a starting point towards this very difficult question is proposing some first principles criteria, not to be dogmatic, but really to just have some foot forward that we can then go and falsify against brain data that gets collected as recording techniques get better and better. So I'll list a couple, but again, just for discussion, not to be dogmatic, but just to list a few. I think maybe one criteria that kind of emerges from common theories, commonly accepted theories of consciousness, like global workspace, Lenore and Manuel's conscious Turing machine, and many others, is this kind of global state and global workspace. And maybe that this global state isn't always necessarily explicit. I'm not sure about this, but maybe it's not explicit. So maybe you're allowed to decode from it, from a neural population in a brain or in an artificial agent, and that global state affects future actions. It's decision sufficient. In other words, it does causally perturbing that global state that you can decode actually affects future actions. Might be one criteria that's like a way of enshrining the kind of global workspace, or CTM. Maybe another aspect of it is valence, having some valence attached to that global state, either over short timescales or longer timescales. There's discussions of like whether emotions versus moods are two different things that operate at different timescales. We need to kind of have a better computational theory of this, but perhaps attaching some kind of valence dynamics to this global state is another important thing in conjunction to the first criteria here, which is consistent, for example, with what's proposed in the CTM. And the other thing, which is kind of comes from the NeuroAI side of things, which is that the content of that state is representationally relevant. So in other words, like we showed in the zebrafish case, right? Let's say hypothetically that zebrafish have subjective experience. Then it's a much stronger case for that if the actual internals of the agent, in addition to satisfying criteria 1 and 2, actually its internal representations like quantitatively actually matched the internal representations of the fish or of the target animal that we're comparing it to. Now, oftentimes I think when it comes to consciousness, we'll care about humans, so we don't have human neural data. But imagine in the future we will, or fMRI or things like that. But basically, you can imagine that this third criteria is basically where the NeuroAI Turing test comes in. You want to see how well does the representational content match a target brain up to the brain-to-brain similarity, right? I think we can maybe all agree that like other individuals are conscious, but that if we accept that as a premise, then consciousness is kind of invariant across this kind of brain-to-brain similarity. So keeping that as the kind of consistent ceiling of the invariant is maybe reasonable to do, as we do in the NeuroAI Turing test. Maybe in some forthcoming work, we'll basically formalize. This needs to be formalized. These are just words, it's intuitions, but they can be formalized actually with certain optimality guarantees on statistical measurement and things like that, which is forthcoming. But really, the thing I want to end on here is the most important step is to kind of identify the neuroscience experiments that most strongly invalidate the above. If these conditions are upheld where there are self-reports, like in humans, which is what we have, to confirm, we can see if they're then shared with animal brains where self-reports just aren't possible. And lastly, if there are no consistent observables across human or even animal individuals, which kind of form an empty set. In other words, like it's always randomly different between different brains, which I think is unlikely, but it could still be the case. Then that might be the strongest scientific evidence that we have that maybe this notion of subjective experience is an illusion. Now, I don't think that's the case, but we ought to kind of engage with that possibility too. And I think this might be one way to kind of adjudicate that as one possibility as well. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time. I'd like to thank my lab, the hardworking students whose work I showed here, as well as my funding. Thank you so much.